This video introduces binding in DataHub WebView. There are two different types of binding, point binding and simple binding, and I'll give you an example or an explanation of the two in just a little bit. We're also going to bind some controls using point binding to real-time data from the Cogent Data Hub, and then we'll move on to simple binding, and we'll show how the property picker will be used to create simple binding expressions. To start with, you'll notice that right now I am in run mode, and I'm going to exit run mode and go to design mode, and I can either click on the toolbar button to do that or choose page exit run mode. And then I'm going to create a new page. So I'm going to click on the new button. And just to clean things up a little bit, I'm going to remove the background image from this page. So inside Property Explorer, I'm going to right mouse click on background image and reset that to the default, which is to have no image. For this demonstration, we're going to use a couple controls. I'm going to first add a circular gauge 1 control. There are a couple different circular gauges, and I've chosen to add circular gauge 1 to the page. I'm also going to add a couple other controls. I'm going to add a label, text label, and I'll move that up here. I'm also going to add a slider control, and finally a simple checkbox control, and I'll position that one over here. And so really what we want to do is bind these controls up at the top here. The slider we're going to bind to the value of SP or set point, and we're also going to bind the checkbox to a data point called auto mode. Auto mode is used to indicate whether the set point is automatically changing. And then we're going to bind our gauge to the process variable, PV. So I'm going to start here by just making a real easy change. I'm going to select the text label, and I'll just enter the value, the text label of SP on that guy, and I'll shrink the size of the label down a little bit and just move this label over. And now we're going to get into binding. So I'm going to start by selecting this slider, and obviously I can enter a value of say 25 on this slider, and immediately we see that change. But of course, what we really want to do is to bind this slider to the value of the set point in the Cogent Data Hub. And to do that, we're going to first start by clicking this expander button associated with the value property. And you'll notice that there are really two different types of binding, the point binding and simple binding. Point binding is used when we want to bind to a real-time value from the Cogent Data Hub. Simple binding is used when we want to bind one property of a control to another property of a control on the same page. In this case, I'm going to choose point binding, and I'm going to simply type SP. The actual data point inside Cogent Data Hub, you'll see here, is datapid::pid1.sp, and as soon as I type 2 characters in this box, it's going to look for a case-sensitive match for this data point, and so that's the point that I want. So I'm going to actually just choose SP right there, and you'll notice that as soon as I chose SP, you can see up here the set point is set, and again you'll notice that at this point that's being updated every 5 seconds. I'm going to continue to bind this checkbox here, so I'm going to select that guy, and just like I did for the slider, I'm going to also bind this to a data point. In this case, the name of the data point is auto mode, and auto mode again indicates whether or not that set point will automatically be set every 5 seconds. And so as soon as I selected auto mode, you'll see that the checkbox went on immediately. Now, one of the interesting things about data points is the ability to bind to something other than the actual numeric value. So while I've still got this checkbox selected, you'll notice that of course I could type in on the text property the word auto mode, but what I'm going to do instead is bind that also to auto mode. Auto mode. And of course, it's now going to reflect a value of 0, 1, or 0 or 1, because that's what the actual value is bound to. But over here on the little drop down, you'll notice that I have other options. I can actually choose to bind to something other than the value, which is this last option. For example, I could bind to the timestamp, and you can see here that this is now showing me the most recent time that this data point value was actually updated. So I can also say, well, you know what, I want to look at the actual quality indicator from the process, or translate to that to a word. So as the value of a data point is updated in the Cogent Data Hub, there's other information that's also updated associated with it. In this case, I actually just want to display the word or the name of the data point, and so I'm choosing to bind it to the short name. And so that makes it really easy to build an interface that actually reflects the contents of those data points. And of course, if the name of the data point in the Data Hub, Cogent Data Hub changes, then these will be changed here as well. I'm just going to collapse those expanders, and I'm now going to bind this gauge to the value of PV. So I'm going to select the gauge, and I'm going to bind it to the data point of PV. Keep in mind that these data points are case sensitive. So again, you'll notice that as the set point changes, the process variable is similarly going to change. And I just want to do a little bit of work to test this right now. So I'm going to go into run mode, and you'll notice that I'll start by turning off auto mode. And if this is working correctly, you should see that even after 5 seconds passes, the set point doesn't change, and the value of PV stabilizes around set point. And of course, as I change the set point, I should see my gauge change and stabilize. And so that seems to be working correctly. I'm just going to turn auto mode back on, and after a few seconds the set point should automatically change, and there it goes. So I'm going to go back to design mode, and going to continue to do a little bit of binding, and I'm going to start by adding an indicator to this page. I want to add a rising falling indicator. So the rising falling indicator is here, and I'll add that, and I want to bind that to begin with to a set point. Now we're actually going to change this in a second as I illustrate simple binding, but I'm going to start by just binding that to the set point. One of the nice properties of this control is the ability to format that with less precision, for example. So I've just now changed the format to include 3 decimal points, and I'll change the size of that, and then I'll actually select both of those controls, and I'll use my align center just to align that rising falling indicator up in the center of the gauge. So you'll notice that at this point, if I expand this, you can see that it's bound to a data point, and of course it's bound to the value of the set point. Well, this is where I'm going to change this value. What I actually want to do is bind it to the value of PV. Well, clearly I could just change the data point binding, but just for the sake of illustration, what I'm going to do is actually bind this rising falling indicator's value to the value of the needle from this gauge, which of course is in turn bound to PV. But I want to do it by using simple binding instead of actually binding it to the data point. So in order to do that, I need to know the name of the gauge and the property that I want to bind to. So I'm going to select this gauge, and you'll notice that first of all, the gauge has a name of circular gauge 11. And that's because it's the first instance of a type of control called circular gauge 1. So Data Hub WebView simply gives it an arbitrary name. And the property to which I want to bind is listed here. You can see that output value is the actual label associated with this property. Now, while it's very important to understand the name of the control, it's a little less important to know the name of the property that we want to bind to. And in this particular case, the name of this property is not actually output value. That's the label associated with it. And the labels could actually be localized into another language, but we need to bind to the actual programmatic name of this parameter. And later on, I'm going to show you how to use the property picker, which eliminates the need to really remember these control names and property names. But I just want to take a second and show you how it actually would work under the covers. So to do that, I'm going to actually turn on one of the options associated with displaying those properties in the property grid. So I'm going to scroll down here to properties, and I'm going to turn on the property called show name and target path columns. And I'm not going to explain right now what the target path column is, but you'll notice that it shows us the name of this property is in fact output value without the embedded space, whereas the label actually included that embedded space. So I just wanted to show you that. Again, those columns don't actually have to be turned on by default. You rarely have to work with them. They're really intended for advanced troubleshooting purposes. But I did want to start by just showing you that there. Let me just turn this back to false again. And so I'm now going to use the information, the name of the control and the parameter name or the property name, and add some simple binding. So I'm going to come back to this rising falling indicator, and rather than using a point binding, we're going to use simple binding. And I'm going to now type the name of the gauge, the name of the control, at to indicate the name of the property, and then output value. And when I hit enter on that, you'll notice that immediately this rising falling indicator starts to be updated a lot more frequently, and it's of course now reflecting the value of that needle. One of the things that's interesting is you'll notice that if I change the binding of this back to point, you'll see that it's actually retained the value of the previous binding, the actual link. So under the covers, it stores the point binding expression as well as the simple binding expression in case you actually did need to toggle between the two, which we don't in this case. So clearly when we talk about a simple binding expression, you might look at this and say, well, boy, that's not that simple. Well, you're right. It's not as simple as we'd like it to be, and that's really the purpose of having this property picker, which is accessible through this button here. So I'm going to start by just clearing the expressions that we've currently set for that control. So you'll see that the point binding expression as well as the simple binding expression have been cleared. So I'm going to come back down to simple here, and I'm going to choose the property picker, and I'm now going to hover over the control that I actually want to bind to, which in this case of course is the gauge, and then specifically I want to select the output value of that gauge. And in the tooltip, you probably have noticed that it shows me the circular gauge 1-1 at output value expression. So I'm going to select that, and you'll notice that it has created that expression and placed it right in there. And of course, as soon as I do that, the expression is working and it starts updating immediately. So that's how we use the property picker to use or to build simple binding expressions. Just one other thing I'll point out here with the property picker, I'm just going to reselect that so you can see it here. You'll notice that there are a couple of options down here at the bottom, in particular filter by matching type and include common properties. One of the important aspects of simple binding is the ability to bind any property of any control to any property of any other control, which might sound a little bit funny because you might not want to bind, for example, a color to a numeric value, but in some cases it becomes very helpful. Some of the properties are Boolean, and maybe you want to render the Boolean as a numeric value or vice versa, or maybe you want to take the actual color of some control and render that as a label, like a hexadecimal value. So by turning on this filter by matching type option, what it will do is limit the values that are selectable to compatible data types. So you'll notice that when I turn off filter by matching type, we have other properties now showing up in this window. Just a second ago, outputs only included output value, but now you'll notice is dragging is showing as well, and you'll notice that is dragging is actually italicized to indicate that it's not a compatible type. The other checkbox that we can turn on is this one called Include Common Properties, and what that allows is to access all of the common properties associated with this control or this gauge, and so you can turn those off, and you get obviously a much shorter list. One other thing I want to point out is how we can change the name of a control and have our simple binding expressions automatically updated. So again, you'll notice that right now the value of our rising falling indicator is bound to circular gauge 11. Well, if I come back here to the circular gauge and I say, you know, that's really not a good name, I don't like that name, let me change that instead to my gauge. And as I hit enter on that, of course you would think, well, that's caused a problem with the binding expression, but you'll see that the binding expression has actually been updated, shown either in the tooltip there or down here, to reflect the new name of the control. So in this video, you've seen how we can bind using point binding to real-time data from the Cogent Data Hub. We've also seen how we can bind one property to another property using a simple binding expression, and how the property picker facilitates that approach.